As immigration reform continues to rankle Congress, USA Today revisited a controversial immigration policy from a different era today. During the Depression of the 1930s, as many as 400,000 Mexican immigrants were rounded up and sent back to Mexico. Many, though, were American citizens. To tell us more about this page in our history, we turn now to Mai Tai, a professor of immigration history at the University of Chicago. She's with us from a studio on that university's campus. Nice to have you on Talk of the Nation today.
Thank you for having me.
Give us some context here. Why were Mexicans being sent out of the United States?
Well, Mexicans were targeted during the Depression because there was a scarcity of work, but they were vulnerable targets because they were a new and growing population, and many people were uncomfortable with their presence. So county welfare agencies in particular wanted to remove them to relieve their roles of these recipients.
Mm-hmm. Well, May Nai, was this a formal program?
They were organized by county welfare bureaus. Los Angeles was probably the largest ones, but many other cities did the same thing, Detroit as well.
But was it a federal policy or just sort of a spasm of local policies?
Well, the federal government assisted these localities in many ways. What they did in Los Angeles, for example, was they staged very spectacular roundups of people in public places and to check their papers and to deport those who were here illegally. They may have been relatively few in number, but the effect was to send a chill throughout the community and made people much more vulnerable to pressures from county welfare agencies that told them they needed to leave.
The story in USA Today, today's edition of that newspaper, tells the story that many of these people were in fact American citizens. Was there no concern for looking at paper? I mean, they just assumed if you were Mexican, you were illegal?
Well, I think what they cared about was that they didn't want Mexicans. It wasn't even a matter of determining if they were legal or illegal immigrants, because most of them were legal immigrants. So there really wasn't grounds to deport any of them, let alone the citizens. Most of the citizens were minors, were the children of the Mexicans being repatriated.
Who would have been citizens by virtue of having been born here.
Absolutely.
What do we know about the people who were repatriated?
Well, we don't know a whole lot. We do know that for many of these families who went back to their home villages in Mexico, that the children had a hard time adjusting. They actually had grown up in the United States and considered themselves to be Mexican Americans, and they were used to living in urban areas, so they had a very hard time. Work was also scarce in Mexico. The Depression wasn't just limited to the United States. So people who struggled here in Los Angeles or Detroit also had to struggle financially back in Mexico.
Mm-hmm. There was an influx of Mexicans, I guess, at the turn of the 19th century who came in for work, the turn of the 20th century. Those jobs, I assume a lot of those jobs had dried up, or at least there was more competition for them in the Depression.
That's true, although that was also very uneven. In urban areas, there was more competition for manufacturing jobs, but there was still a lot of agricultural work, and there were some employers that didn't want Mexicans repatriated because they needed their farm labor on the farms.
Mm-hmm. Of course, Mexicans were not the only minority group to suffer this kind of discrimination during the 1930s.
Well, they were the only group, actually, who were repatriated back to their homelands.
Others had difficulty. Now, the numbers here are hard to calculate.
They're very hard to calculate, in part because it was not a coordinated federal program, so they didn't collect statistics. The estimates range from at least 350,000 to as high as 2 million. 2 million? That's the estimate of State Senator John Dunn of California, who sponsored a bill recently in the California legislature apologizing to Mexican families for the violation of their civil rights. As I understand it, tomorrow Representative Hilda Solis of California will introduce a bill to create a commission to examine the forced emigration of Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans, and as part of this effort to come up with some, to acknowledge that this happened in the first place and extend an apology. That's right, and there's an interesting precedent for that as recently as the 1980s, where under pressure from the community, Congress formed a commission to study the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, which did result in an official apology and in reparations.
And finally, this story comes out, of course, in the middle of this immigration debate today in Congress over current issues. What do we have to learn, do you think, from this example of the 1930s that would be useful in today's debate?
Well, one crucial difference, of course, is that we're not in a depression today. We still need the labor of immigrants and use the labor of immigrants. But I think one thing that is similar is the potential danger of removing citizens from the country. That could happen again today if illegal immigrants are deported, if they take their children with them. Those children would likely be American citizens, or it would result in the separation of families. It's hard to say which is worse.
May Nye, thank you very much for being with us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
May Nye is a professor of immigration history at the University of Chicago and joined us from a studio on their campus.